Well, welcome to those of you who have joined us. We probably will have a few more joining us today. I think we have a lot of folks on vacation this month, so we have a smaller group than usual on the call today, but that means more opportunity for everybody to ask questions. So be thinking even now the kind of questions you might want to talk with Scott about. At any rate, my name is Bob Truby. I'm the National Director of the Emerging Scholars Network. And for today's topic, many of us for many in the church, Christian history is largely this blank slate between the time of the New Testament and one's own faith journey. We may be aware of a few isolated episodes in church history, like Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland, or St. Francis preaching to the animals, the Crusades, the Reformation, or maybe in kind of our postmodern outlook, we only think of diverse histories without any connection or continuity. We have the history of our denomination or our group, and then others have their histories. Well, our guest today, a scholar of the world Christian movement, believes that there's a thread that runs through this history, and that it's valuable for us to be readers of that history, to become informed and aware of what we're a part of. Before we begin, I'm going to just orient us to our time together. We are recording today's conversation, and if you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, please keep your mic muted and disable your video. By continuing to participate in the conversation with your video or audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes. I'm going to stop the recording now, and to give you a time to disable your video if you wish. And while I do that, while we stop it, I'll touch on a couple of other details here. Scott Sunquist who has his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, is the president of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which you may have read about recently as moving from their facilities in Wenham, Massachusetts, into the city of Boston, which is going to make a lot more opportunities for PhD programs and other kinds of things in terms of work with people in the city of Boston and collaboration with other seminaries. Yes, Scott may talk about more of that at some point. Previously, he was a professor and dean of the School of Intercultural Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. He taught missiology and Christian history at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and lectured at the Trinity Theological College in Singapore. He's the author of Explorations in Asian Christianity, Understanding Christian Mission, and The Unexpected Christian Century. He's also an editor of a dictionary of Asian Christian history and co-author of A History of the World Christian Movement, volumes 1 and 2. Scott is a former InterVarsity staff colleague, and as a little factoid here, Scott and I were actually in the same orientation of new staff class back in 1977. So 45 years later, here we are again, Scott. So welcome.
And neither of us have changed. We look exactly the same.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, I think you look exactly the same. And I probably have a lot less hair.
Yes, yeah,
so
I do remember you with more hair.
I envy that particular blessing that you have enjoyed. Well, anyhow, Scott, maybe just to get into this, I get the sense that this, like many books, had a long gestation process. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about how you came to write it.
Yeah, I've been involved in history since college. I majored in history education and have been thinking about history of opera, history of economic activity, the geography of economic activity in North America. I took all kinds of history classes and have naturally been, I guess, driven into thinking about history with a thick description. Not just biography, not just history of ideas, but the economics, the sociology, ethnicity, nationalism, all these different things working together. So when I worked on the history of the World Christian Movement project, that was about a 10-year project. We had sociologists and anthropologists involved from all over the world. There's 35 to 40 people involved in feeding in information. So I would write an outline for 3 or 4 chapters. We'd gather together it would be critiqued from Ogbukalu, who passed away about 5 years ago. From Nigeria, it'd be critiqued by somebody from Brazil, somebody from Colombia, somebody from India, Egypt, and so they would give their perspective. It was like my second doctoral defense, because every time I outlined a chapter, I would get feedback from them, and then I'd write 5 or 6 chapters. We'd gather together and get feedback from all the different perspectives. So what that did was that beginning in the late 1990s, I began to think about Christian history. I had to think about it globally. And then I realized that's not the way I was taught church. I was taught church history, the history of the church. It was usually denominational or ideological. It was an apologetic of defending sort of the Reformed faith or the Protestant faith, at least. And it wasn't sort of naturally gracious or generous to other church traditions. And neither was it very informed about Asian Christianity or African Christianity, even Latin American. So the way that I studied church history is it started like in Jerusalem and Antioch and Alexandria and then Rome, and then like Paris, London, Wheaton, Illinois, and Pasadena, California. And then there it is. And so that's why we have this great church history. And then that's why we're right. Now, it wasn't said exactly like that, but it was clearly a defense of the Protestant faith in that tradition. I never knew about the Persian church. I never knew about that early Indian church. I never knew about the Ethiopian church, except for a couple paragraphs. So I did a dissertation on Narsai and the Persians. One of the first, interestingly enough, he was a seminary president, and he was a president of a seminary of about 1,000 students. So we're very similar. So here I am in the 21st century, a seminary president of about 1,000 students, and so is he. But his seminary was made up mostly, almost completely, of converts from Zoroastrianism and astrology and that sort of thing. In his theology and his preaching, it was almost like the Psalms. It was distichs or poetic, and it was balanced parallelisms. Very different. And it was so different that when I taught about this early Persian Syriac Christianity in Singapore, I told them this is early Asian Christianity. But they were so westernized, they didn't recognize anything about that as being Asian. They just thought it was weird. And so I began to think, wow, this is very complex, how we understand Christianity in different cultural contexts. So fast forward, I wrote a lot about Asian Christianity and compiled a bunch of articles and chapters that I'd done in a book. And then I did my last, the 20th century section for the history of the world Christian movement was rejected by my publisher. And so I published it as a separate book, and it's actually done very well, but that's the one called The Unexpected Christian Century. And it basically has this thesis that the West, and this gets me into this book, the West assumed that in the 20th century, it would be the Christian century. Remember, they changed the periodical, even named it that way. And from the Edinburgh 1910 meeting, they assumed that they could do the evangelization of the world in our generation with steamships, with railroads, with empires, everywhere. We could bring Christianity all over the world, and it's going to happen in the next generation. A lot of hubris there, a lot of progressivism there, complete misread about Christianity, as if Christianity spreads by the brilliance of modern science and human efforts. Nobody at all at Edinburgh 1910 thought that the Christianity in Europe would collapse. Remember, it's held in Edinburgh, and most of the people who attended were from Germany, from France, from UK, Scotland, so forth, and the United States and Canada. Nobody said that that's going to be a part of Christianity in the next century. It's going to collapse in the West. But that's really what's happened. And that's because there was a misunderstanding of Christianity. And I argue in this book is also a misunderstanding of how we understand Christianity. Because, well, maybe I'll just stop there. That's how it got me involved in all this, is these different projects and realizing, as I say in my opening phrase, as Andrew Wall said, Western theology is too small for the global church. And I would say our Western history that we've been writing is too small to explain what's happened in Christianity.
Well, one of the things you touch on in the opening of your book is this whole thing of Christianities and the trend in scholarship to speak of Christianities in the plural. And that reflects this, on the one hand, this perception of the diversity of expressions and so forth of Christianity, and the growth of the church beyond the Western world. But you also see some things problematic with that. And I wonder if you might talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I mentioned I think it's a Cambridge Encyclopedia, World Christianity. The last volume, they talk about Christianities. And that's when they really talk about world Christianity, as if the other Christianity in the West is one, but once you get to Africa and Asia, it's something different. It's like almost a different religion. We don't do that with Buddhism. We recognize, and Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism are so different. I mean, there's not even a God in Theravada Buddhism. And so you can't get much more different than that. And one's approach of complete unattachment, the other has an approach of meditation. And we don't talk about different Buddhisms. It's Buddhism, okay? It is Buddhism. This is Christianity. And so if we're going to identify Christianity as a single religion, as diverse as it is, we have to understand, well, what is it that gives it coherence? And so I've written about that in the past, and so did Andrew Walls. And I think we have to say there is something that gives it coherence, and show that so that Christianity, whether it's Ethiopian Christianity or Syrian Christianity or Lutheranism in Germany, or here is a Lutheran church right across the street here in Boston, founded by Norwegians, but now pastored by a Ghanaian woman. Now, what's happened there? It can only make sense if you understand this is all one Christianity, but it has these different expressions, but there is coherence. There's a difference between this Lutheran church that's Norwegian, but pastored by a Ghanaian woman, mostly Black and white folks from the city of Boston. That's different from Mormonism. And that's different from the Unification Church, for example. That's just a different religion, and we wouldn't call it Christianity. So we have to be clear about what I say, the center. So what is the center? And we focus, and I defend, or try to defend, that Christianity is a centered set faith more than a bounded set faith. Now there are boundaries, but the boundaries are determined by how close you are to the center. And there comes a point, just like in a satellite, if you get too far out of orbit, you lose the gravitational force and you're going somewhere else. So I like the centered set. That's a mathematical expression, but I like centered set to describe Christianity. But what is that center? And that's where I describe the center is the cross. And then I unpack that.
Well, yeah, and getting to the kind of the main idea of your book, you describe a conversation or a question that a South African ethicist asked you after a paper presentation. And I wonder if you might talk about the question and your response and how it connects to what you're doing in the book.
Yeah, it was one of the most humiliating moments of my life. I was at Princeton as a visiting scholar there at the Center for Theological Inquiry. And I was working on volume 2, I think, or maybe 3 of History of the World Christian Movement. And so I presented a paper to about 12 scholars from around the world that were in residence there. I mean, just amazing people. I was humbled to be with these people. So I presented a paper basically on the history of historiography to get to how are we today? How do we get to where we are today when it comes to writing church history? And when I was done, one of the things that came up was I was so concerned about postmodernism and some of these approaches. And this chap from Germany and another chap from Switzerland and a guy from South Africa said, well, that's not really important. I said, yes, it's very important. The American Academy of Religion, the American Historical Society, you have to deal with these issues. Oh, no, that's not really important. Not in Europe and Africa. We don't care about that. So I was really dumbfounded. I spent all this time defending how do we negotiate all this. And so this guy just said, kind of swept my paper aside and said, Scott, you've been working for about 10 years on Christianity globally, not just American Christianity. Very few people have done that. And you've had to read about African Christianity in the East and South Africa and the Middle East, studied the Caribbean. Very few people have been reading that widely. And so then he said, what have you learned? So my mind was just click, 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 clicking. And what came to my mind was a number of places where Christianity has grown. It's grown among illiterate people. And it's grown where people didn't have a church or they were nomads. So the phrase that I came up with is that Christianity is very fragile, and yet it transforms the world. How is it very fragile? Well, it's just words spoken into the air. It's just something simple like God created us and we've rejected God. And the only way we can come back in fellowship with God is if we trust him, we have faith in him and his work through his son, Jesus Christ, he sent to earth, who died for our sins. So we have to recognize that we're sinners and we need God and trust God and then follow him. Something simple like that. You can unpack your atonement theory and everything else, and revelation of the Bible, but that's really what it is. And I've done a lot of evangelism. I mean, in many different countries of the world. And that's the amazing thing, is that people will hear something and they write, yes, I am a sinner. I do need God. Oh, thank you. I've been looking for that. And if God's spirit is prepared, then they respond to that. Now, they may not have read anything. They may never have been to church. It's not dependent upon an institution, an empire, a church building, a seminary, even though I think seminaries are very important. It's not dependent upon that. It's just words spoken in the air. And so I call it a thin red thread that goes through church history. That thin red thread are those words about redemption offered through Jesus Christ. And it's red because of blood is required for the sacrifice for our sins. That message transforms whole families and villages and eventually countries. And that is what's so amazing. It's a very fragile thing. It's just words spoken in the air that can transform. Well, it transformed me. It was just words somebody spoke to me, and it completely changed my life. And so when we study Christian history, we have to take seriously the message is what we're tracking. And the message can be abused, it can be misused, it can be used by presidents, czars. Putin can use the church for his endeavors. Kings and princes and royalty in the past have used it for their own ends. But that doesn't mean the message is wrong. That just means it's been misused. And then we have a reason to critique it if we know what that thin red thread is. Then as we study Christian history, we find weird things we can go on. We say, is that Christianity? Or is that Christianity being used by other people for their own ends?
Wow. Well, you in your book, you go on to, you actually suggest that thin red thread has 3 strands, and that forms kind of the body of your book. And I wonder if you might just talk briefly about those strands and why you think they're important for our understanding of Christian history.
Yeah, my title for the book, sorry, InterVarsity Press, I wish you hadn't changed it. My title for the book was Time, Cross, and Glory: How to Understand Christian History. But I think the publishers like in the front, they want what the book's really about. It's really about history. But I like the title, Time, Cross, and Glory. And on the cover, I don't know if you can see it, but on the cover, they have there, it looks like the clock. There's the time and there's the cross. And then I guess this is sort of like, a wreath, or a victory wreath of glory. So nice artwork, but I wish that had been in the title and not just in the picture. So my understanding is that, and this comes from living in Asia, most people in the world, their world is cyclical. It's seasonal. It could either be the seasons of wet season, dry season, or it can be fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, and it's a cycle. So they assume that all of time is cyclical, and that somehow or another got started and it just kind of keeps going. And in some religions, such as Buddhism, we need to get off that cycle. It's a wheel, and it's a relentless wheel, keeps going around. And even our births and deaths, we're born, we live, we die, we come back, we're born again, and we got to get off of it. For others, and for the ancient Greeks, there's a beginning, a building up cities, and then there's this huge conflagration. It all burns and collapses, and then it starts over again. You begin to build and build and build, and then it'll all burn up and it'll collapse, and you start over again. So there's that cyclical kind of dimension to it. But the revelation that comes in Scripture, and so it's only found in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and any religion related to that, is that no, God created everything. And it's extremely important to root all of our teaching of ethics, all of our teaching of history, all of our teaching of the Christian life in God, the Creator. God started. So there was a time when there was no time. There was a time before time. And then God created. And then there is a progression in God, and then there's a fall, and then the center of history is the cross. The cross is the center of history. Everything looks forward to that, and then after that, and that points the way forward. And there will be an end. And Christians are actually driven towards or working towards that end. That end can be seen in Revelation 7, Revelation 21, Revelation 22, Jesus' prediction of the kingdom, the great banquet. So there is a goal of glory at the end of time. And so time started, there's a center of time, and there's an end of time, which is glory. And that glory will not be fully revealed in this earth. It will be revealed at the end of time, and then it's timeless, no more time in eternity. Now, the reason I think that's important is because when we research and write and teach history, that is that's an ethical, moral vocation. Teaching is a moral vocation. And so it's important in our teaching to be able to see the moral dimensions of what we're doing. So it's not just this happened, this happened, this happened, so what? Well, we can critique what happened according to this understanding of God, how God created things, how he's redeemed things, and where it's going. And so those elements together help us both in our Christian life to know how to live, but also in how to teach and research Christian history. And let me give you an example of why this is very important for me. In a number of books that I've written, publishers would say, don't use so many adjectives, or don't use so many adverbs. And I said, well, that's what makes writing exciting. Writing without adjectives is like flat and boring. No, but you can't. I said, well, these people really were ruthless. I mean, look what they did. They came through and they raped and pillaged. They burned everything down. I mean, how do you talk about the Mongols and just describe what they did? I mean, my gracious, in a paragraph, you can describe just the sort of the slash and burn across Asia all the way to the gates of Vienna at the time of the Reformation, of all things. You can describe that in a paragraph or two, or you can just, in a whole book, describe they did this and they did this and they did this. Well, I think it's valid to use adjectives if you have a way of evaluating what's going on. And I think we owe it to the church and to leaders to recognize my teaching is a moral activity. It's not neutral. The Enlightenment would like us to say, just the facts, ma'am. That's all I want, just the facts. Well, facts are powerful. How do you choose what facts to write about? 90% of what I research, I throw out. It's only 5 or 10% that I really write about. Well, how do I determine what to write? And then I also make the comment that when you write history, the only way the mind works, it remembers things is as a story, as a narrative. And if I can tell a quick story, if I'm talking too much, you just interrupt me, okay, Bob? But when I came to Gordon Conwell, I asked a lot of people, all of the faculty, about what had happened in the past, what they'd like to see change, what they'd like to see in the future. And of course, everybody tells the new president things that he needs to know because some things are done wrong. And now I have the truth and I want to help you so you lead it better, okay? But nobody knew the whole story of what had happened, how the decisions were made. So the way people remember things is they knew this and they knew this, and they fill in the gaps because that's the way your brain works. You have to fill in the gaps. It's called a story, a narrative. That's the way we remember. And they would fill in the gaps usually 80% of the time with something negative. That's why I'm reformed. I believe in total depravity. Every facet of our life is fallen, and we tend to see things negatively. So they fill in the gaps. Well, that's the way when I write history, a good history is a great story. Grant Wacker's written 2 good biographies of Billy Graham, and it's a story. He tells the story about him. And there are great historians that the reason they're great is because they tell a story that makes sense. Now, you can critique that story and say, oh, you should have told more about this or that. But what a good historian tries to do is do lots and lots of research, really dig deep down. And then you can say, aha, now I see. Now I see what was going on. There was all this manipulating and controlling back here. It looks like this is going on. And then you tell the story as best you can, leaving out 90% of it, but to tell what is going to help the reader, forgive me for saying this, but being a better person. In other words, there is a moral dimension to what we do. Let's admit it and do it well, but do it accurately. And therefore, we can critique I critique the Crusades. I critique a lot of when Christians are caught up with property, and that includes some forms of dispensationalism, which say Jesus they have to build the temple, he has to return to Jerusalem, and this kind of thing. I say, no, I'm sorry. When Jesus came, the glory now is displayed in people, not in buildings. The temple is the church, according to Paul, but also the temple is our bodies. The Holy Spirit dwells here. And therefore, there is not a sacred place. Sacredness is found in people. Now, histories that try to defend a sacred place because this is holy ground and other ground is not holy, I think they need to be critiqued because many people have died trying to defend sacred place and holy places. So anyway, I'm kind of riffing on the whole thing there, but the reason for those three major themes is so we can do our Christian history well in a way that actually reflects what Christianity is, and we have lessons from it that help us become better people.
Mm-hmm. Well, hey, we got to take a break here and let people know how they can get your book. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit of information here.
All right.
Okay, so the book we've been talking about is titled The Shape of Christian History, although Scott had a different title for it, but that's the title InterVarsity Press uses. And it's available at the at InterVarsity Press at the web link that's actually in your chat. And actually, right now, this and other InterVarsity Press titles are available at 40% off plus free shipping when you use the discount code 40IVCF22 at checkout. So this is your time not only to get Scott's book, but if there's some other titles that you'd like to get, please stop by and do that. So with that, we're going to transition into some audience question and answer. I don't think we have any questions in the chat yet. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask Scott a couple things that we haven't gotten to yet, but please do feel free to get questions in the chat, the things you're wondering about. One of the things I wondered about, Scott, was how you use these particular strands in a particular episode of Christian history. Say you're studying a particular, say the emergence of the church in China following the revolution. How would you draw on these three strands, or how would they shape the way you tell the narrative of that particular story?
Yeah, that's actually fairly easy one. Why don't we choose one that's more difficult?
Okay.
And that's the history of Black Christianity in North America, because this approach helps to explain it. You see, in the past, we've seen that the church grew as it developed and kind of in progressivism, as it advanced and progressed. And therefore, there's a need for resources to support the spread of Christianity. Mm-hmm. Now, Black Christianity, these are people who are brought over by Christians who enslaved them in Africa or brought them from other slave owners in Africa. They're brought to the States, and then they're living on plantations with a Christian Lord and master. How in the world would anybody become Christian in a situation like that? You mean you would absolutely reject everything that person has done to you and split up your family and maybe raped your wife? Why in the world would would be a higher percentage of Christians among the Black population in the United States than white population. And I think it helps to explain that when you see that it's not dependent upon that our histories in the past were dependent upon certain resources in order for Christianity to grow. Typical of many students that I get, if they've gone to a major university, they say, oh, missionaries were always compliant with empires and colonial powers, and that's why Christianity spread, because of colonial powers. And I say, oh, really? Well, that's interesting, because Lamin Sanneh made the comment that African Christianity grew more rapidly than any place in the world after the colonial powers left. The colonial powers prevented Christianity from growing. And the British Empire signed a number of treaties with Muslim lords in West Africa, as well as in Malaysia, to protect them from missionaries. So missionaries were not allowed to work with them. So how does that explain? So you have to take a look at the facts. And the facts are that Christianity itself, that message, that thin red thread, has a powerful ability to bring about influence and change in individual lives. And so if you're looking at Black Christianity, then you study University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill has a great website of slave narratives. And so they've collected most of the slave narratives that are extant. And you can do a word search in there in any of those manuscripts to find out about conversion, sin. And can you believe it? People that were sinned against still understood themselves as sinners. And they repent and they would love to follow Jesus. And they found life meaningful following Jesus and in community and singing praises to God. And so it makes sense of that kind of history. And then we go to China and say, well, it makes sense of that kind of history to say, the missionaries all thought that, well, when I was in seminary, we thought that Christianity was dead in China. We didn't even know if it would survive. Yeah. This was back in the 1980s, because I'm very old. Unlike you, Bob, you look very young. Back in the 1980s.
No, I remember this too.
Yeah, we thought that there's no more Christians, and we had spent so much. We spent more money in China than any other country because we were elitist. We thought that Chinese culture, because of the long history of literacy, Confucianism, philosophy, political theology, ethics, those are the people going to become Christian, right? And so we invest. So if in the 19th century, if you want to be a missionary, first choice, China. Second choice, Japan. Third choice, maybe Korea. All Confucian, all have literacy history, okay? And then India, okay? And then last choice, Africa, okay? So there were false assumptions about how people would come to faith in Christ. And we were wrong. So this concept that I have helps to explain the surprising growth of Christianity and the surprising ways that Christianity develops, even when it doesn't have support, even when it doesn't have money, even when it's being persecuted. And then when it has everything that it needs, freedom to worship, money, big buildings, institutions, it declines in the West. Unbelievable.
We had Robert Chow Romero on here sometime back talking about his book, Brown Church, and just a similar kind of story about how the Latino church grew, not because of, but in spite of imperialism and colonialism. And he traces that, and it was just an amazing story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what this gives is an ability to study each form of Christianity on its own terms. That's my point. We study Christianity on its own terms, and we study the development of Christianity among different languages, nationalities, ethnic groups on its own terms.
Scott, you raised you made an observation about teaching as a moral activity. And so Jonathan has a question for you. How would you help Christian professors from various disciplines at secular universities to approach their teaching and scholarship as a moral activity? How can they teach and write about their subjects as not just a set of facts, but connecting them to the larger story of God's work in history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it begins by having a conversation with faculty of why do we teach? Why do we educate? Of what advantage is it? Because even St. Augustine in his, forget where it was he wrote it. It may have been in, I'm not sure. Anyway, he says, all that you get when you educate a thief is a smart thief. In other words, as a neutral activity, you just may be making a better criminal or a more careful murderer. So education itself only makes a bad person a smarter bad person. So the reason we're involved in education should be in order to make people better and society better. And then we have to decide, well, what's a better society? Is a society better if everybody can do what's right in their own mind? Well, hopefully we don't believe that, but some people are coming close to that. If you have certain sexual appetites and they change, you must have the freedom to express that any way you can and want to. And that would be good for society. If you want to, have sex as much as you want to and have babies and then abort them at will, that's a good and healthy thing. Well, we don't think so. So then we begin to talk about what does it mean to be moral, but at least we're having that good discussion about what it means to be moral and ethical and how to have a more moral society and what does it mean for people to thrive in society. And Jonathan knows about studies on thriving from his job that he had in the past, but human thriving is very interesting to study because there are certain people who thrive in the worst situations. You never guessed that they would thrive. And other people have everything that they need and they don't thrive at all. They become drug addicts or murderers or they commit suicide. So it does get involved in all these sorts of studies, but at least to have the discussion and raise the issue of what are we doing in education. It's not just downloading facts and information, because if we do that, we can make bad people worse.
Well, I wanted to ask one of the questions that I also was thinking about was the last chapter in your book is about reading Christian history and the value of that. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about, by the way, that was one of my favorites. I enjoy history and Christian history, but for busy academics who don't lack things to read, why would you suggest reading Christian history is important, and where would you begin?
Today, let me answer the second part of the question first. Because I like that. I like that question a lot. Where would you begin? Today, if I'm in the West, I would begin with the early church, because our situation today is more like the early church than like the Reformation or Enlightenment or the 19th century, the age of progressivism. We are living in an early church age where most societies and cultures oppose Christianity. And I'm involved in higher education. Believe me, the Chronicle of Higher Education makes it very clear it's a strong agenda which is not friendly towards Christianity. And it will only get worse. It's not going to get better. We're not going to create a Christian country. That won't happen. So let's face the fact that, as Jesus said, his kingdom is not of this world. And therefore, those who love and want to serve the Lord will be persecuted. So by reading in the early church, we'll be better prepared for that. I read every day from the Philokalia, which is writings from the first 8 or 9 centuries of the church, compilation. Volume 1 focuses on that. I just find it extremely helpful because I'm reading, in a sense, church history, primary source documents from the first, usually it's 5 to 7 centuries. And what they're writing there is extremely helpful, a lot more helpful than stuff that was written in the Reformation, frankly, because the Reformation assumes that everybody around is basically Christian. It's just a matter of whether they're my kind of Christian, or I think they're good Christian or bad Christian. In the early church, it's a struggle to survive, and you're being persecuted. Even if the emperor is Christian, you're still dealing with a culture which is predominantly pagan. So I would start in that area of the early church. Second, another place that I would start would be with biographies. We learn more than anything, I think, from biographies, from people, decisions they made. And they can be good people or bad people. but we learn by the decisions they make. And then when you read about a Mother Teresa, or you read about a Billy Graham, or you read about A.J. Gordon, or whoever you read about, they're not perfect, and you find out decisions that they made that probably weren't right or could have been better. But you also realize, with the information they had, every decision they made was a compromise. I try to tell people that when it comes to institutions and churches, or as a seminary president, every decision I make is a compromise. There's no perfect decision. Every decision I make is going to hurt somebody, or somebody's going to be displeased or receive it as being hurt. And so by studying biographies, you see how people made those decisions. And sometimes you can feel their struggle as to what they were going to do. And this is very helpful for us. It's extremely helpful. It helps us to be really fully human about these things and facing up to how we're living today. So I would start with, biography in the early church. You could do a lot worse. And then, but your first question was why? I think one of our biggest problems in worship in North America today is we are clueless about how we got to the church today. And we don't understand what worship is. We're making it up. I wrote a book called Why Church, published by InterVarsity Press. And why did I write it? I visited 35 churches in the LA area within a year. My wife quit after about 14 because it's really tedious if you go visit a different church every week. But, a Thai church, Chinese church, Korean church, Black church, white church, Catholic church, Episcopal, Bible church, Reality LA, New City Church, all kinds of churches. And the thing that struck me is most all of the church plants in the new churches and the larger churches did not have a clue about the history of Christian worship to understand, oh my gosh, there's so much more. And all they're doing is singing songs for 20 minutes or half an hour, and then a prayer, a message, and then if you want it, you can take some bread and wine on the way out. I mean, I've literally been to churches like that. And so history helps to explain why we do what we do in worship and why it's important to do these things for the sake of our souls and for the sake of the church. Churches can just explode on a personality. Huge, everybody wants to come there, and they don't realize that they're dependent on a personality and not on the Eucharist and on the worship service, which is a theology that we meditate on every week. So that's just in one area. And then when it comes to mission, I was talking to somebody as on the board of a very large mission organization, or type of mission organization. He had never heard of the 3 self principle, and he's involved in funding very wealthy, funding very entrepreneurial evangelists and church planners around the world. And they're sending huge amounts of money to people to support them. And I described the 3 self principle, which goes back to the 1860s in Shandong province, China, and that was picked up in North Korea by the Presbyterians there. It's a great principle. It will prevent a multitude of sins. And what this chap didn't understand is they were developing sort of a welfare mentality of these churches around the world. So there are all sorts of things like this. Why do we have to make all these same mistakes? These mistakes have been made before. Let's make new mistakes. But when it comes to mission history in particular, there's so many great lessons, good and bad. And, shame on us for not taking the time to sit down, to study about what's been done, where were some of the failures, and where were some of the people that pressed on and did things in the midst of very difficult situations and had the right priorities. And there were some that were just empire builders. They were building hospitals and churches and schools. And then you have the communist revolution in China, and it's all gone. And you had built a church dependent upon institutions. Well, we should learn from that. We should learn that the church is not big institutions. The church is the church, as Leslie Newbigin used to say the church is God's only plan. There's no plan B for changing the world. It's not kings. It's not seminaries. I hate to say that. Anything that serves the church, may be used by God for a period of time. But anyway, those are all history lessons.
Yeah. Hey, we got a question here from, and please forgive me if I mispronounce it. It's Imlaku. What role does church history have in discipleship making ministry, especially in Africa?
That's a very good question. I don't know the whole answer to that, but let me just hazard a couple guesses. Of course, it depends where in Africa, but there is a very important history of early African Christianity that many Africans don't know. West Africans don't know much about early African Christianity, both in North Africa as well as in Ethiopia. And I would suggest there's some very important lessons about various African cultures, because there are many different African people groups or ethnic groups. You're from Nigeria, okay? In East Africa. And then you have huge lessons about ethnicities and tribalism in Africa that overwhelmed the church. And so you have ethnicities and nationalities becoming more important than the gospel, and the gospel is often discredited by that. So when you're discipling people in, say, Nigeria, you've got so many different ethnic groups there. A part of that discipling can see in church history how the church has failed in the past by having ethnicity become more important than the unity that the gospel brings together. And then also some good examples of African leaders who have crossed those barriers and brought people together. And there's some great stories about that. And that's a great encouragement, I think, for a young disciple. So you're studying the Bible and you're reading some stuff from church history. You're from Nigeria. Kalu was a good friend of mine, and he taught me a lot about the development of Christianity in Nigeria and the great revival movements that took place there. That would be very helpful for Nigerians to know about that, what went right, what went wrong in the second and third generation after those revivals in the 70s, and I guess mostly in the 70s and 80s. I hope that helps.
Well, Scott, we're getting to the conclusion of our time. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you about, maybe to wrap us up, this has been a time where there's a lot of discouragement as people look at the American church, at least the American white church. Actually, there's a lot of vibrancy among churches of people of color, it seems. But as people look at the white church in North America, there's a lot of discouragement, at least among people I talk with. What would you say church history, your own reading of church history would say might offer hope to those who are really wrestling with that right now?
Well, in the 18th century in America, you could be very discouraged about the white church in New England as it was becoming deistic, Unitarian, universalistic, and so forth. And surprisingly, God did a surprising work, according to Jonathan Edwards, in bringing about renewal and revival, which had great social implications. A lot of people don't think about that. They think, oh, churches were revived, more people attended church. No, it's sort of like D.L. Moody's revivals. It affected families. They were struggling with alcoholism at that time, and a lot of men got off alcohol and came back to their wives and families. And you can take a look at all the social institutions that were formed in the 19th century from the Second Great Awakening, the beginning of the 19th century. So we can look at these times when God does a surprising work as we humble ourselves and move forward. And I think we do need to look back at times like that and say, first of all, it's God's work, not ours. And we do need to repent where we've made, these gross errors, but then not let that hold us back, because God is God and we're not. And if there's anything God loves to do, it's to take something that looks like a total failure and breathe life into it. I mean, the cross is a good example of that. But as is David, King David, what a failure. Send somebody to be murdered and moves in on his wife and so forth. And then there's repentance and favor. So I think to give into sort of that defeatism is to give the devil the driving seat, and that's not Christian at all. We're people of hope, and as I talk about time crossing glory, we didn't talk about glory, but glory is we see what I call little glories in this world, and that's where the gospel is having an impact, and all of a sudden, you know, a YMCA is set up in the city, and these boys on the street who are working in these factories are taken care of and they're fed. And we see homeless shelters come up, and we see people going and talking before city government people about the homeless situation. And we find Christians, you know, building hospitals. One of my great examples is Russell Conwell, who was of the Gordon Conwell. Russell Conwell started this or revived this little church called Grace Baptist, and it became Temple Baptist Church in Philadelphia. And he started a little night school in the basement, which became Temple University. But he also started, most people don't know this, he started 4 or 5 medical clinics throughout Philadelphia because people didn't have access to medical care. So it's just like a normal thing to do. You see the needs around you and you start things. And he wasn't held back by the fact that his church had been in decline and it was terrible and people weren't going and it was run down. He said, well, that's the case. Now we have something that we know we need to do. So he started medical clinics, Temple has a hospital, and then became a seminary, and a very important seminary that combined with A.J. Gordon School. So these are people who weren't held back by the negative things going on around them. They held on to the gospel. So those little glories, I think we should look for and lift them up and say, look at what God has done here. And that will be a great encouragement to the next generation.
Scott, thank you. This has been wonderful. Well, we need to draw to a close here. One more time, we want to let people know how to get your book. The book, Scott's book is The Shape of Christian History, and you can purchase it right now from InterVarsity Press at 40% off with the discount code 40IVCF22 at the checkout. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I think it's a great read and a great encouragement to read further into Christian history. So I would commend it. We also want to let you know about our next conversation. Our next conversation is with William Edgar, who has a book that's just come out called A Supreme Love, which actually riffs on John Coltrane's album, A Love Supreme. Edgar is a theologian and jazz pianist. He argues that the music of jazz can't be properly understood apart from the Christian gospel, which, like jazz, moves from deep lament to inextinguishable joy. William Edgar is a professor of apologetics and coordinator of the apologetics department at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, as well as an associate professor at the Faculté Jean Calvin in Aix-en-Provence, France, and that's my very rusty French. So we'd encourage you to join us, and in a moment I'll have that link in the chat. Again, we want to thank you for being with us today. If you're not already a member of the Emerging Scholars Network, you can join for free at blog.emergingscholars.org. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESNIVCF, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well at youtube.com/ESNIVCF, where this recording and other recordings of past conversations are posted. And so in concluding, we want to thank you for joining us today. Thanks especially to Scott for taking the time out. Scott's just come back from vacation and I'm sure has a plate full of things to address. And so we appreciate him taking the time today to be with us. We also want to thank and acknowledge InterVarsity Press for their assistance in setting up these conversations, and are very grateful for their participation. So thank you everybody for joining us today. With that, we will conclude the recording, and if you wish, you can